marching on the freedom land. Keep on walking, keep on talking, keep on walking, keep on talking.
You're listening to Black Belt, a podcast where we amplify the voices of Black folks down south, working toward solutions to some of our region's biggest challenges, all with a dash of well-seasoned Southern fun.
Keep on talking, keep on walking, 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 keep on talking, keep on.
Hey there, it's Adina White with Black Belt. On today's episode, we're turning the microphone over to Dr. Karama Neal. If you're wondering who she is, check out episode 43 to hear her story and learn why she urges people to choose Arkansas as a place to call home. Take it away, Karama.
Well, hello and welcome to Choosing Arkansas, where we share stories to encourage you to make Arkansas your new home. Thank you so much to each of you for joining us today. We are very pleased to welcome our guest for today's show, Jean Block. Jean is an attorney who serves as CEO of the Little Rock Water Reclamation Authority, which is the sewer utility for the city of Little Rock. And we are very pleased and excited to hear her story. Jean, welcome. Welcome to Choosing Arkansas.
Thank you, Karama. I'm thrilled to be here with you today.
Thanks so much for being willing to share your story, and we're excited to hear it. And I'd love to maybe just start where it started. You've mentioned, I've seen in interviews talking about how growing up in beautiful Mill Valley, California. And I wonder if you'd share a little bit about what growing up there was like and how that informed your decision to stay in state for college.
Yeah, so Mill Valley is just outside of San Francisco. It's just across the Golden Gate Bridge, about a 15-minute drive from San Francisco. And it's a fairly small town, I would say, I don't know, maybe 100,000 people, probably not even that much. But it is nestled at the base of Mount Tamalpais, which is a beautiful mountain known for hiking. And the claim to fame is that mountain biking was founded there. I don't know that that's true or not, but it's with the Pacific Ocean and lots of mountains nearby. Mill Valley is known for just a lot of outdoor recreation and activity. And my childhood really encapsulated that. I grew up in a very small family. It was just my younger sister and my mom and I. My sister is 2 years younger than me, but my mom, she has Midwestern roots. She's grew up in Oklahoma, and it was really important to her that I be outside. So I grew up playing soccer and running track. Tried basketball for a little bit, but that was never really my sport. But just an active kid and grew up going to private schools, but had a really, I think, well-rounded childhood, full of fun, but hard work. You asked the question, what led to my decision to stay in state for college? And although I was first generation college, my mom drilled into my sister and I from a very young age that it was not a question of whether we were going to college. It was really just a matter of where. I ended up staying very close to home for college. I went just across the Richmond-Santa Fe Bridge to Berkeley and attended UC Berkeley. And, I always knew I would stay in state for college, even though, my parents divorced fairly young and my dad was in the military and had lived in Hawaii and Illinois. But it never occurred to me to leave the state for college. And so when all the schools that I applied to were fairly close to home, it came down to UC Berkeley and St. Mary's in Moraga, which was just 20 minutes away from Cal. And for me, as I was debating the two schools, it came down to, do you want a small private school? And I had attended small private schools through, the 12th grade, or did I want a completely different experience, from a I don't even know how many students St. Mary's had, but I knew Cal had 30,000. So I knew I had a choice of two extremes, and I opted to go with the big city, a little city, big school, and no regrets with that decision at all. It was a great experience at Cal. It challenged me for sure.
I can imagine. That's Cal Berkeley has such a um, in my mind, very positive reputation. I guess it depends on what one's perspective is. So I imagine that would have been pretty cool to go to school
Yeah.
there. When you left though, and as you after you graduated and you went to go to law school, you did choose to go out of state. And I wonder if you went to Kansas. And so I wonder if you could talk about that choice and that
Yeah.
transition, right? That's a big transition. It's not like, I don't know, you went to Oregon or someplace,
Yes.
also kind of nearby. Talk to us about that
Yes.
transition and that choice.
Absolutely. So I was a sociology major at Cal, and around my junior year, I realized most people who are interested in sociology will pursue a PhD and then write or teach. And none of those appealed to me. Getting a PhD, writing or teaching. So I was like, okay, what are my other options? And a close family friend who I respected greatly, who had also gone to Cal, said, "Jean, have you thought about a law degree? It's a versatile degree." and the skies may well have opened at that moment, because I didn't know lawyers and I didn't know what a law degree could do, but I this idea of having a degree that was versatile and I could do different things with really resonated with my 19-year-old 20-year-old brain. And so then when it came time to apply to law schools, my dad at that point had retired. He was from Kansas originally. He'd grown up in Wichita, Kansas, and had retired from the military after 25 years to Topeka, Kansas, which is about 30 minutes from Lawrence, Kansas, where the University of Kansas is. So when he learned that I was going to apply to law school, he begged me to apply to KU, and he drove to the law school and got an application. This is the mid 90s, so you couldn't download it from the internet at that
Yeah.
point. And I thought, well, Dad really wants me to be there. Um, at the time, the rule of thumb for at least law schools was, you have three dream schools, three realistic schools, and three backup schools. I will say that University of Kansas was not my dream school. I'll just leave it at that. I was hoping to stay at Cal, go to Bolt or Stanford, but they had other thoughts. And the University of Kansas was the first school that I heard from. And they flew me out. Um, and I spent 2 days touring Lawrence, which is much like Fayetteville, Arkansas. It's a great college town. In the mid 90s, it was known to have a tremendous live music scene. Everybody from the Roots to Lauryn Hill, would go through there. And as I finished my visit, I was flying back to the Bay Area. I called my best friend and I said, "This is where I'm going." And yes, the second part of your question was about a transition, and it was a transition. It's the Midwest, and while I had spent some time in the summers there periodically with my grandmother or aunts or uncles, it's a very different thing to live there as an adult. Something that's very funny is they call Lawrence, Kansas, the Berkeley of the Midwest. And having just left the actual Berkeley, I remember just thinking, "Oh, you all have no idea."
Not so much.
But it turned out to be the best decision for me for many reasons that we might touch on. But I never had any regrets about that decision. Yeah.
It's really, it's excellent to hear as you're thinking, as you talk about that. I think about, one, you're thinking about the law degree itself, right? And how versatile that is. And my father's an attorney. He practiced law and served as on the court for some time. And so I sort of had, and really until I moved back home to Arkansas, I had frankly a bit of a more narrow understanding of what one does with a law degree, because I saw what my dad
Mhm.
did, and most of the people I knew who were more like him, and they, they practiced law, and they, maybe they were judges or something, but it was in that sort of realm. And after I moved back home, and again, it was maybe similar to kind of how you were talking about, like, you visited Kansas, but it's one thing to visit as a child, it's another thing to live there as a grown up, as an adult, right,
Mhm.
who's making those decisions. And
Mhm.
so similarly, like, I'd grown up in Arkansas, and I'd seen what my dad did, seen what, his colleagues and stuff had done. But then when I
Mhm.
came back on my own as an adult, and I'm making my own friends,
Yeah.
I'm engaging in my own work, and, it's like, wow, this law degree thing really is really, really versatile. Like, it's a real
Yes.
utilitarian degree. You can do so much with it. Um,
Yes. Yeah, and I will tell you, I love to talk to young people about my experience with a degree because I think it's important that individuals who are thinking about law school know that because there is typically a sense of you get your degree, you go to a firm, and you work and you make a lot of money. That is one path, and I fully respect that path. But, there's the nonprofit realm, there is the government realm. And when you talk about government, state government, there's just so many different arenas. And so I talk very specifically about how, at this point, I've been a lawyer for 24 years, and I started as a public defender for an Indian tribe and then did bankruptcy work, representing banks and mortgage companies. And then I went to the Attorney General's office and built up the healthcare bureau and did that for 7 years. And then I was recruited to be chief counsel of the state lottery. And then for 7 years, spent chief counsel in the environmental sector and municipal sector with my current utility. And so I say that my experience it's the definition of versatility and how a person can practice law. And I think it's important that people know that there are so many different options, and lots of potential paths to pursue.
Yeah, I think, part of the reason I highlighted that, and you've helped me sort of segue into that a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later, is like, you know, I think many of those things, based on what I've seen of your resume and your experience, many of those actually those like those big work experiences that you had were in Arkansas, right? And so the
Mhm.
ability to have this degree that is really flexible, that's very
Yeah.
versatile, really gives you so many options. I would
Yeah,
say particularly in a state like Arkansas. And obviously, we'll talk
absolutely.
a little bit more about that as we go forward. So
Yeah.
thank you for sharing that. The other thing that I think was really compelling as I think about, the kinds of stories that we're sharing on Choosing Arkansas is that your dad was from that state, right? And it was a place where you had visited as a child, and there was some
Mhm.
there was some level
Yeah.
of familiarity. I wonder if you could share a little bit more about that.
Yes, I think it is fair to say that had I not had that thread to Kansas, it never would, obviously, it wouldn't have entered my mind, but I probably would not have been willing to make the choice to move to the Midwest. I knew that there was going to be a culture shift. And it wasn't an earth-shattering culture shift, but it definitely took some adjusting.
Mhm.
Um, and so I don't know if that answers the question.
No, it does. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think part of that is sort of, being willing when you have that kind of a thread, right? That
Yes,
might allow one to say, like, okay, I'm not quite sure what I'm getting into, or I'm not sure what
yes,
this adjustment's going to look like, but I'm
yes.
willing to take that step, right? In a way that, if it's completely new, might be a little bit more challenging to do. Not impossible, right? People do it all the
That's
time,
right.
but it might be a little bit more challenging. And so I appreciate that. And
Yeah.
one of the things, as I understand from your bio, you met the man who would become your husband while you're in Kansas.
Yes.
And so, while you talked about a thread to Kansas and how you probably
Yes.
may not have made that choice had you not had that thread,
Yes.
talk about, did you have any thread to Arkansas before you met Ronnie? Was there
Well, and Karama, I will answer that question in a moment, but I will start with this, which is when I was leaving Berkeley, to drive to Lawrence, and my dad had driven from Kansas to pack me up and move me out there. One of my two best friends, Temba, said to me, I'll never forget, he said, Jean, you're going to meet your husband in Arkansas. And I said, you have lost your mind. That is not going to happen. But I did end up meeting who would become my husband. Of course, when people hear that story, they say, well, is he a lawyer too? He is not a lawyer. He is from Southeast Arkansas, the Delta, and had graduated from college, University of Arkansas at Monticello, about 3 years earlier. And he had moved up to Lawrence, Kansas with his then girlfriend, and they had made kind of settled there. And by the time I arrived in Kansas, they had long been not together anymore. But what's so interesting is I had been in Lawrence, Kansas for not even 30 days. And the law school had a dance, the barrister's ball. And my husband is a musician, and his band had been asked to play. And I was there, if he were telling the story, he would say, I was there with a little dude. He might have been vertically challenged, but Rodney and his band were playing, and he turned to his friend and said, that's the kind of woman I'm going to marry. And fast forward over a year and a half, I would be downtown Lawrence catching live music, and he might be playing, or we would pass each other on the street. He might be with, a young lady, or I might be with somebody. And so our orbits really just kind of never strayed too far from one another. And about a year and a half in, he knew some folks from the law school who were classmates of mine, and he was asking them about me, and they said, oh, you're talking about Jean. Yeah, she's cool. And we ended up meeting shortly thereafter, and dated for 4 months, and knew that we were going to be together. I was actually on the verge of moving to DC and finishing my final year of law school in DC, because I had planned to work on the Hill or somewhere. But I was 1.5 feet out the door, and just that short period of time of dating, and knowing, both of us knowing that this we wanted to not be apart and not try to have a long distance relationship. And so yes, he then became my thread to Arkansas, and no surprise, not a spoiler alert, the reason why I came to Arkansas in the first
Really
place.
beautiful story. That's a really lovely story. Of course, I know both of you and
Uh-huh.
really enjoy his music, and of course really enjoy you. And I didn't know that story before. It's really nice. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
sharing that. I wanted like so I should say, in full disclosure, this, I'll share this with the audience as well. My husband is not from Arkansas, and Arkansas was not at all. I don't think it would be unfair to say. I think if he was here, he would say, yeah, that's right. It was not at all on his radar before we started dating and courting and stuff. And so I wonder if you could talk about any impressions, if you had any. I think like for my husband, for Quajo, I don't think he really had any impressions, because it just was so not even in his realm of thinking
Mm,
that he didn't even have any impressions of Arkansas. But I wonder if
mm.
there were impressions that you had, or impressions that you gained as you got to know Rodney and maybe others from Arkansas before you moved here.
I would say short answer is no. I did not have any Arkansas. It was never on my radar.
Yep,
Kind of
understood.
like Turkestan's not on my radar. Arkansas had never been on
Mhm.
my radar, and but over the course of us dating, and then of course, after we were married, we would make trips here um, 2 or 3 times a year, and it was very eye-opening for me to see um what life looked like in the late 90s, early 2000, for a small Delta town that was itself going through transition. When Rodney was growing up, I think the population of Dumas, his hometown, was maybe 8 or 9,000 people. But fast forward to the late 90s, early 2000s, it was shrinking rapidly. And I think now it's maybe 4,000. I and and it didn't take me long at all to really I, I'm gonna detour for a moment. I have learned I have after being here for 20 plus years, maybe 21 years, I've come to see, I think there are two Arkansas. I live in central Arkansas, Little Rock, capital city, a city of, we just hit 200,000 people. And and if you look at Little Rock and the surrounding areas, the five surrounding counties, the experience of living in Arkansas is vastly different than if you're living in pretty much any other corner of the state except for Northwest Arkansas, which is the fastest growing part of the state. And so to see, even as immediately in the 2000s, um, you know, what life in a small Delta town looks like, where the amount of jobs in manufacturing and healthcare systems and medical providers and this, the resources for schools, just not even the equivalent of what I was seeing here in the central part of the state. That was a big eye opener very early on, and something that I saw, have seen continuously. The other thing that was an eye opener for me, and I remember Ronnie and I had probably been married for 3 or 4 years, and I remember him telling me about growing up and how he was not able to swim in the community center pool in Dumas. And and so I was literally doing the math in my head because he was born in 1970, and I then and now, you know, could not conceive of a reality in the early 70s where my husband could not swim in a community pool. And so that reality was, which plays out in many different arenas beyond just a swimming pool. And if we're honest, plays out even to this day, not a swimming pool, but in other arenas. And so there was definitely some moments that really took me off guard. Like I can't even barely verbalize it now. But yes, that there were some really interesting transitions that I had to really experience as I learned this new place that I was living in.
I appreciate you sharing that, Jean, because I think part of, and honestly, I think in a lot of ways you all should be commended because I think it is it is very easy to go and live sort of in one place, especially if it's, the kind of the big
Mm,
city or the relatively big
mm,
city, right? Um,
mhm,
and not experience the rest of the state, not have a sense of what the
mm,
rest of the state looks like. My dad is from a small town in the Delta, right? My
mm,
mom is from a smaller town in South Arkansas, right? And so growing up, although I've in Arkansas, I've only lived in Little Rock.
yeah.
Um, I definitely had that perception as well of like,
Mm,
what is it like for my cousins, right? What is it like for my relatives who live in those places now, right?
yeah.
And
Yeah.
having that sense and balancing it. And I'll say as well, part of as you were talking about that, I was thinking very intentionally about I lived in Atlanta for 14 years, right? And
Mm,
there's so many
mm,
people who come to Atlanta. It's a great place to come. You should come to Arkansas too, but there's Atlanta's
mhm,
a good place to be as well. And so many people came to Atlanta and only experienced Metro Atlanta. Really had
yeah.
no sense at all of anything
Yeah.
outside of Metro Atlanta, right?
Yeah.
And I really, and I that was not for me. That was not something that I wanted to do, especially after I
Mhm.
had a little more, after I got out of grad school, had a little bit more time, right?
Right,
I was
right.
excited to ride around other parts of Georgia, right? It was
Yes,
understanding different aspect of the South for me. It was, and so I
yes.
enjoyed that. But I definitely saw a lot of folks, friends and colleagues who did not do that and were very
Mhm,
intentional about
mhm,
not doing that. And so I
mhm,
appreciate the fact that you're thinking really intentionally about the whole state and
mhm,
really
mhm.
understanding, yes, there are challenges in places, but yes, obviously some great people come there, some great people are there,
Absolutely,
and so
absolutely.
really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you.
Yes, and I will also say, my husband is he is a proud Dumas native, and he has been very fortunate, and well, he's exceedingly talented musically, but he's been fortunate with the opportunities he's had. But he is intentional to go back and play in not just Dumas often, but the entire southeast part of the state. And I guess I'm bragging on him for a moment, but it's about, he talks about how being a young kid in school in Dumas and how an arts program would bring a a guitar player that was the arts in the schools, and so he is very intentional to do that same thing, because we all have a tie to our homes, and that tie is critically important. So while I am not in the southeast part of the state in the same way that he is, I have always really admired how he could easily just kind of focus on this area and the bigger parts of the state, but it's really just the opposite.
I honestly, I commend both of you all for doing that, for continuing that, because I think a lot of folks don't necessarily make that choice. And, obviously folks will make the choices that they want to, but I
That's
think,
right.
in as much as we're all connected, it's helpful to
Yeah,
be able to build on those connections
that's
to the
right.
mutual benefit of everybody, right? We all
That's
learn
right.
from that, we all gain from that. So
That's
very
right.
much appreciate that. So I think we'll take a quick break and hear from our
Okay.
sponsor. We've got you in Kansas. We got you hearing about Arkansas. And so when we come back from our break, we'll hear what it's like when you actually get here. So please stay tuned, and we'll be back in a moment after a word from our sponsor. All right, so welcome back. Thanks so much for joining us. And before we left for our break, we were hearing about Jean's meeting of her to-be husband, Rodney Block, who is from Arkansas, and they were beginning to learn a little bit. She was beginning to learn a little bit about Arkansas, and then at some point, obviously, you all decided to make that move. And so I wonder
Yeah.
if you would share a little bit about why you made the move. Like what were you contemplating as you all decided, like, we're going to move to Arkansas, this place that a few years ago had not been on your radar at all.
No, and I'll tell you, even when we made the decision, even in the years leading up to it, it had not been on our radar. When I graduated from law school, of course, by then, Rodney and I had been married, and he'd been with me to the Bay Area at least once, if not twice. And of course, he loved the Bay Area. It was his first time being there as a musician. He loved the jazz clubs. He just loved everything about it. And of course, I loved everything about it, but except for the cost of living. And I knew very intently that I, I didn't ever want to live in the Bay Area until we were in a financial position to not be struggling. And I only say struggling because the cost of living is so high that unless one is living 2 hours away and commuting to San Francisco or that area, or working 80 hours a week, it's just was never a quality of life that I wanted to have for myself. And Rodney was on the same page. And so we ended up moving to New Mexico, which was heading west, right? Moving in that direction. Stayed there for 2 years in the Albuquerque, New Mexico area. Never felt like home for either of us. And at around the 2 year mark, when we were making the decision where we were going to go next, and both being honest with each other that we were not in a financial position that where we would not have to not struggle. um, Rodney's parents were having some health issues, and so that was the impetus for us to move to Arkansas. And Rodney is one of six kids, and he is exceedingly close with his siblings and his parents. Very warm, tight knit family. And so once the decision was made, I would say almost as soon as we made the decision that we were going to move to Arkansas, we made the decision we were not going to live in Dumas. At that point, I had practiced law for 2 years. Rodney had continued his music, having a band, even in New Mexico, but he also had a full-time job working as a recruiter for UNM, University of New Mexico. He'd always kind of done something in sales. And so we knew that Dumas was not going to be a fertile ground for either of us from a professional standpoint. And not to say at all that we wouldn't have been able to get jobs and do work, but we wanted to be in one of the larger areas of the state and have more opportunities. And so we actually didn't live in Little Rock originally. We lived in a suburb of Little Rock about 30 minutes away, Conway, Arkansas. And another college town. You kind of see a thing. We like college towns. And so that's the story that got us to Arkansas.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think, for some, I had in some ways a similar story that, my husband and I were living in Atlanta, and I I knew always that it's some, not always, but I had known for a very long time that at some point I wanted to move back to Arkansas. I remember
Mm.
being very clear, it's like being out with my husband one day. We were working in the yard, and he said, "Karama, I know we're going to live in Arkansas one day. It'll be fine. We can do that." And feeling like
Mm,
this huge relief that I didn't know that I
yeah,
had. But
yeah.
the impetus and the timing was really based on my mom's illness. And I think
Mm,
part of what I like about the way in which you've talked about that story just now, right, is that you recognize there's a reason to be nearby and to be
mm,
close. But
mhm.
that does not necessarily have to look exactly like it looked for him when he was in high school, for example, right? Which
That's
might have
right.
meant living in Dumas, right?
That's
And I think
right.
for so many folks, like, they think about Arkansas and they think about, like, oh, this is where I grew up and this is the only option. And it's not,
Mhm,
right? There's so many other
mhm.
kinds of places that would
Yeah,
allow you to maybe maintain that familial relationship or
that's
maintain the
right.
professional goals that you have, still be in the state, still be nearby, but
That's right.
do some of the other kinds of things you want. So I appreciate you
That's
sharing that.
No, that's right. And I appreciate it that it never was a really a question. And I had never thought about it until this conversation right now. That was never a conversation or a question that Rodney, posed to me. And it might have been because he knew I'm a big city girl, and that might have been too big of an ask. But in any event, we were on the same page, so that was good.
Yeah, that's excellent. So y'all, you got here, you got settled in Conway, and
Yes,
then later in Little Rock area. And so,
yes,
can you talk a lot about like what you learned? Like what was surprising? What did you find as you were beginning to settle in, both then and
yeah,
now, as you, I think you said, 20 plus years on? What does that
yes.
look like for you? What is how's this worked for you?
Yeah, I will tell you something that was very surprising to me that I saw very early on was well, first of all, people are very friendly. It's a beautiful thing. I had never experienced the warmth and friendliness, the natural friendliness of people in the South, in the Southern culture. And that was really very refreshing. Um, Along those same lines is, you know, people here have grown up with the same group of people. And whether it was, in school and then going to the same camps and then often going off to college together, and just I noticed a lot of um, clicks, and I don't say clicks in it with a negative connotation, but it was a very tight knit um, groups of communities,
Yeah.
Black folks, white folks, no matter what the age was, and that for probably my first 3 or 4 years was a really interesting dynamic to see. And not that I was ever trying to um, you know you know kind of infiltrate, but it is just a reality of this of this state. And I can distinctly remember, I've always been one that has just a very tiny group of friends. Um, and I can distinctly remember telling Rodney around year like 3, like, I don't have one friend. And it wasn't even a woe is me, poor me, but it was like, wow.
Yeah.
I wonder. I was a little surprised at that. And it's amazing how things end up happening. But within probably a year and a half of that, us having that conversation, I met 2 women, one of whom was a transplant like me,
Mhm.
um, who, and then another woman who I worked with, not a transplant, who would become dear, dear friends. And so that was a really interesting experience on the personal side, but it also translated on the professional side. Um, I didn't go to law school here. And so I didn't have the benefit of having a class of 100, you know, friends who could tell me about the latest opening over here, or, posting over here. And um, when we moved here from the Albuquerque area, we had our house hadn't sold in New Mexico. We had just bought a house in Conway, and Karama, I ended up working at a water bottling plant off of Asher,
Mhm.
um, because I needed a job. I was studying for the bar exam. I obviously, because I had only practiced for 2 years in New Mexico, I wasn't able to waive in through reciprocity into Arkansas. So I had to take the bar exam again. But, I needed a job. And,
Yeah.
there's not too much pride when you have 2 house notes. And, Rodney was working in sales at the radio station. Um, but it was really, it was a bit of a head trip to see how hard it was, even from a professional standpoint, when I didn't know a soul, I didn't know anybody.
Yeah.
But I knew I wanted to practice law. I knew I was not going to work at a bottling plant. It was good for short term, but it wasn't the long term career
Yeah.
given my law degree.
Hmm.
um and so those were some of the, in those first 6, 8 months, and then a couple of years, those were some of the really interesting challenges slash experiences that I navigated, both on the professional side and the personal side.
Gene, it's interesting. The word that you use, click, is actually the word that I've used. It's when I
Mhm.
first came to Arkansas back home, right? I mean,
Mhm.
I felt very similar in that regard. Obviously, I had family here, and so there was that network of people who couldn't not claim me, right? I mean, we can. I mean, I guess they could not claim me, but that would have been a little harder. Um, and so, but I actually felt similarly in a lot of ways. And I
Mm.
think it did,
Mm.
as you were talking about, I'm looking forward to hearing. I'm going to ask you next about sort of what that transition looked like and how, because
Yes.
clearly that's not where you are now, what that transition has looked like for you. But I think I felt the same way. And it's been interesting. I'm actually thinking now about sort of, what would it to think it'll be interesting to think intentionally about what that transition looked like. Because I think
Mm.
I felt it. I think if I asked my husband, I think he would have felt it too. I don't
Mm.
know that he feels it that way now. And I think some of that
Mm.
is just sort of getting settled in your
Yes.
profession, sort of getting settled
Yes.
in a little bit. And so anyway, tell us about that. What is, what you described at first? I mean, a transition is a transition. Transitions are often hard.
Yes.
What does it look like now though? for you?
Well, I would say it is the opposite. I would say um, it's almost a little unnerving because I think about the the world that I inhabit in Arkansas now, and it's partially because my husband is a musician, and so when I say the worlds that I inhabit, I know many lawyers, and that's not a surprise because I'm a lawyer. Um, but I have also spent the last 20 years um, volunteering with many, many nonprofits. So that is a big world of mine, the nonprofit space. And, you know, knowing people who work in the nonprofit sector, but knowing people who volunteer. And so who are the people that volunteer? People in the community. So knowing so many facets of the Little Rock community, men, women of varying ages, black and white, um, you know, uh, blue collar, white collar. Another big world of mine is the world of creatives, since my husband is a creative.
Yeah.
And while I'm not a creative, um, I have really warm ties to many. Um, which I think suppose would probably surprise a lot of people because, I am a lawyer, and I will say that I'm not quite, existing in a box, but I'm not the all-encompassing creative as I think about them. But it is a really wonderful, rich, diverse mix of people who are in my orbit, and I love that. And I think that's because that probably goes to you know, my love of my real love and embracing of diversity, of thought, of class, of profession, and wanting that richness around me. But also at the same time, from a personal sense, having a small group of women who I, deeply treasure as friends, and then another group of women who I deeply respect and have gotten to know and build relationship with over the last 5 or so years. And then on the professional side, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit more, um, Arkansas, Central Arkansas has provided opportunities far beyond what I ever could have imagined. I will be the first to say, um, I have worked hard for at every place that I have been, but it was never anticipated by anybody that this woman from San Francisco Bay Area would be the CEO of a sewer utility, the largest sewer utility of the state of Arkansas. And I think it is only in a place like Arkansas where hard work and opportunity can blend to create heights that don't normally exist.
I mean, we've talked a little bit about this. I feel the same way. I feel like, so many opportunities I've had, I never would have had, frankly, had
Yeah,
I stayed in Georgia. I just it would not have,
yeah,
it wouldn't have happened.
yeah,
And Arkansas, when I was growing up, when Rodney was growing up here, it was the land of
yeah.
opportunity, right? That was our state motto. And
It was.
the natural state is good too, right? Because we do have a lot of really great outdoor stuff. It's
It
great to
is
see.
beautiful here.
It's a
Yes.
gorgeous place to be and a gorgeous place to be outside. Um, but I think sometimes that land of opportunity is lost. Like we forget that it really can be a land of opportunity, right? When you do
Mm-hmm.
it, I really like how you said like the mixture of hard work and opportunity. Like
Mm-hmm.
is not trivial. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's so much opportunity to do things, to make connections as a small state. I like to talk about
Yes.
small state advantage. Um,
Yeah,
and so I wonder, you know, as you're saying, just talk a little bit more about how that has kind of manifested in your
yeah,
life, if you would.
absolutely. I, I joined the Attorney General's office in 2005, and the Attorney General at the time was Mike Beebe. And within a year, well, actually about 6 months, he ran and became governor.
Mhm.
And so a new Attorney General came in, Dustin McDaniel. Dustin was the youngest Attorney General, I think, across the country. I think he was like 35, 36, which was about my age. Um, and and he came in and was longtime friends with somebody who I worked very closely with at the AG's office. Again, another one of my contemporaries. And to this day, I don't know what my friend Brad said to then Attorney General McDaniel, but he must have said something because within 6 months I was asked to serve on what was a fairly prestigious group in the utility, which was the legislative committee, and it was 10 lawyers from across the utility that went over to the Capitol for the 5 months that the legislature was in session, and they, you know, uh, testified on legislation for and against, and they drafted legislation, and they met with legislators. It was a big deal, um, and that opportunity led to a bigger opportunity. And again, same legislative team, same attorney general. In 2009, Barack Obama had just had enacted the Affordable Care Act, and there were a number of people in the Arkansas legislature who basically wanted to say the Affordable Care Act was not going to be law in the state of Arkansas. We know that that's obviously not constitutionally allowed. And Dustin called me up to the 11th floor and said, Jean, we're going to oppose this legislation, and I'd like you to be at the end of the table to do it. And CNN will be there, and MSNBC will be there. It will be a big deal. I have full confidence in you, but if you don't want to do it, I respect that. And I went home and I talked to Rodney. I said, well, Rodney, he wouldn't have asked me to do that if he didn't think I could do it.
Yep.
So even though it scares the bejesus out of me, I'm going to do this. And sure enough, all those media outlets were there, and I was on the front page of the paper the next day. But in that room, Rodney was in the back of the room, just like kind of sending me some good
Mm-hmm.
vibes and all that. But the room was packed, and that afternoon at our afternoon legislative meeting, the guy who was our main lobbyist turned to Dustin and said, the question I kept getting was, who is that woman? Because you need to send her up to the table every time. I tell that story because that led to me 3 years later getting asked to leave the Attorney General's office and be chief counsel for the Arkansas Lottery. I didn't know how to be a chief counsel. I didn't know the first thing about the lottery and how to be counsel for the lottery, but it was that same thing. Okay, well, the new executive director of the lottery is not going to ask me. Oh, what he said was, Gene, I was in that room when you testified, and I saw, and I need somebody who remains calm under pressure. And I think you're the right person for it. And so, so again, I stepped in and said yes to that opportunity. And then a few years later, at this point, Rodney and I were living in Little Rock. And one of the reasons we moved to Little Rock is I knew I wanted to serve on a border commission, kind of take my volunteer efforts a little bit further. And I took the then city manager, Bruce Moore, to lunch. I didn't know him, but only in a place like Little Rock, Arkansas, can you call the city manager and say, can I take you to lunch? I'm interested in serving on a border commission, but I don't know the first thing about these 10 different ones in it. And we went to lunch, and he said, Jean, I think you should consider the sanitary sewer committee for the wastewater utility. Everybody wants to be on the airport commission or be on the port commission, but the sewer utility is the most critical infrastructure that we have. Without it, there's not economic growth, there's not residential growth or city growth. Um, I think that's the one you should serve on. And so I spent 4 years serving on that commission. Um, while I was on that commission, the CEO said, Jean, would you come over here and be in-house counsel to us here at the utility? I ended up saying yes. And he said, Jean, I also think in 4 years when I retire, I could see you as CEO. Now, when he said that, it was, I mean, he may as well have said, let's fly to Mars, because I never thought of myself as a CEO. I didn't know what a CEO did. But he ended up spending 7.5 years in the role, and I was right by his side as a senior leader in the organization. And again, only in a place like Arkansas, I think, can a person have the professional trajectory that I had, with opportunities presented, and maybe the resume at every juncture didn't necessarily align with the opportunity that was being presented, but stepping into those opportunities has frankly led me to where I am today.
It's a really, as you say that, thank you so much for sharing that, first of all, because I think it is, sometimes I think people will hear those kinds of stories and think, oh, this is something special. And not to say that you aren't special, but these kinds of stories, these kinds of like, oh, I talked to this person and this person saw this in me and they were able to give me
Yes,
this opportunity. Like, that is very common. I've certainly seen it in my life. I can name
yes,
many other people who have seen in their life. And
yes,
as you were talking about that, it reminded me of how we both thought of sort of cliquishness a little bit. But I
yes,
think it sort of translates, like the positive side of that is what we're just talking about now, right? The fact
yes,
that you can call somebody up and say, let's
yes,
have lunch, right? The fact that, like, oh, I saw so and so, I'm gonna find them, I can figure out who they are, and I'll connect
yes,
with them, right? And so while that may not be the sort of stereotypical, like, oh, I saw this on a newsletter and I applied and it was, and
right,
not to say there's anything wrong with that. There's a lot to be said
right,
about the process too, right? But the fact that this other type of path can exist and can be so beneficial
yes,
in ways that I think both of us would say are completely unexpected. I also have a resume that does not align with an education that does not align with my current
right,
work at all, right?
right.
But it really does allow for that kind of opportunity, and I
Absolutely.
really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. So as we close, I wonder if you would just share a little bit. Like, I remember when I asked you about this and we talked a little bit, you were eager to participate, and we are so
Absolutely.
grateful for you doing so. Talk about why you felt like this was something you wanted to do. Like, what is
Yeah.
it that you want people to hear or understand about the decisions that you've made, and what those decisions might look like for potentially for someone else's spouse who's like, "You want to move to Arkansas?"
Well, I will start with the certainly the Little Rock metro area, and I think the state the in the Northwest Arkansas, but I think the state as a whole punches above its weight. I will be the first to say, when Arkansas became on my radar, I wasn't necessarily thinking, that it is that, and I'll talk more specifically about the Central Arkansas area, that it is what it is. From a culture standpoint, whether that's music, whether that's art galleries, whether that's a variety of creatives that are here, it's far more than I would have thought. The food scene, just again, if you'd asked me 25 years ago what's Arkansas, I would say a bunch of kind of fast food chains. That is not, our food scene has a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of people who are probably more in this city of people of privately owned, restaurants than just fast food chains. Um, so again, remembering that Arkansas really punches above its weight. But why did I want to do this? I think that it's important that people know that there are so many parts of the state that are just tremendous. The warmth and the people and the culture is one, and it's real. Um, the natural beauty of this state, and I'm partial to it. I'm partial to the beautiful parks, the bluffs along the river, the lakes all over the state, beautiful hiking trails. So in that regard, for people who like the outdoors, biking, hiking, walking, there's a lot that this state has to offer that I don't think people would ever really think about. Um, and then I would say a sense of community. I don't think people know that with time and with some involvement in one's community, however that looks, there really is an ability to build community here. Um, in a way that I didn't think existed when I first got here. But I see it more and more regularly. And then finally, professionally, obviously I've shared my story, but my husband's professional journey mirrors mine. And while our careers, he's now a full-time musician, and while our careers couldn't be more different, the same sense of we say in our house all the time, we started from the bottom, and landing in Arkansas, and both of us having to build our careers. But it's not just he and I there are many people that I can point to who have been able to be very successful no matter what their realm is or their field is. Because, and I go back to the hard work and combined with that community, really lends itself to opportunities that I don't think exist in many other places. So I call Arkansas home. I am proud to call it home. And I do think that if people gave Arkansas a chance, and didn't just kind of mentally strike through it when it's first mentioned, I think they'd be pleasantly surprised. So I
Wow, I
wanted to
think
share
that's
that.
thank you so much. I feel like that's just I mean, it's the perfect closure, right? It couldn't be better said than that. I really, I'm again so grateful for you just so generously sharing your story, right? I mean, really sharing that so openly. Really, really appreciate it. I feel like it's going to inspire a
Absolutely.
lot of people. I know, particularly for folks who, as I said, don't have Arkansas on their radar, right? It's one thing
Yes,
if you're moving home. It's one thing if you're moving where all your kin folks were grew up or whatever.
that's right.
It's another thing when it's a
Right.
completely different place. And
Yes.
your story and your trajectory, I think, will be really helpful for folks who are thinking about maybe considering a decision like that. So thank you again so much. We really
Well, and
appreciate it.
thank you, Karama, for doing this, for spotlighting our state in a way that it deserves. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks so much to all the audience for you all for you listening. Please do share this. The whole goal is to get these stories out, to get more people thinking about our wonderful state and encouraging
Yes.
them to choose Arkansas as home. If you'd like to reach out, we welcome your feedback at choosingar@gmail.com. And of course, we hope that you will choose to make Arkansas home. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Karama. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to subscribe and leave us a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts so others can find us. You can also listen to the Black Belt Podcast on most streaming platforms, including Spotify and Amazon Music. This episode was produced and edited by Katrina Dupins and Prentice Dupins Jr., with theme music composed by Prentice Dupins Jr. I'm Adina White, executive producer and founder. Black Belt is a production of Black Belt Media. Connect with us on social media and at blackbeltvoices.com.